Okay, hello everybody. Primitive Substance YouTube channel, and we got a very special guest, Richard Boch, who has a book out called The Mud Club, a very famous club back in the early '80s that I had the pleasure of playing at a few times, and we want to hear some of his great stories. Richard, thanks for coming on.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
So, give me some background, how you landed in New York, and are you from the city, or and how you got in the club business there?
Well, just just a brief bio there. I was born in Brooklyn, Ridgewood, Brooklyn. I grew up on Long Island. I left Long Island for University of Connecticut, UConn,
Okay,
and I was there until 1976 when I moved to New York City. I got my first apartment on Bleecker Street, right across the street from the Village Gate.
okay,
Bleecker and Sullivan. And I stayed in that apartment for just a little over a year, 13 months exactly.
okay.
And at that point, I took a loft down in Tribeca. Didn't really know how I was going to manage it or how I was going to afford it. I was sharing it with someone who I went to high school with, same person I shared the Bleecker Street apartment with. The way I wound up at the Mud Club, I was already going out. My intent was I was supposed to be, I was supposed to be in graduate school at NYU for fine art, for printmaking and painting.
Okay.
And I was enrolled, and I was accepted, and I enrolled. I set up my course of schedule, my schedule of courses, and I just got so wrapped up in New York nightlife, basically going to CBGBs, going out to the Lower West Side, going to the clubs, that I never wound up going to NYU. I took some one-off classes at Parsons School of Design, at Pratt, their printmaking center on East 13th Street.
Right.
I never really pursued my graduate degree. During that time, to support myself, I wound up, it was actually my second job after moving to the city, attending bar at what was a cabaret, basically,
Hmm.
in Soho. It was one of the only restaurants in Soho at the time, called the Ballroom.
I never heard of
And
that.
they would have, you know, sort of marquee names doing nightclub acts, song and dance routines. I mean, Joe Papp, who started the Public Theater,
Oh yeah.
he did a 2 week run there. Estelle Parsons, who won an Academy Award for Bonnie and Clyde, she did a
Hmm.
2 week run there. So like it was people like that. Uh, so it was a very high end operation. It was sort of dinner theater, if you will. But I also had a big crowd at the bar. You could pay to just sit at the bar or come to the bar and watch a show. And somehow I became friendly with the staff at the Soho Weekly News, which
Oh,
was the
okay.
big, which was the alternative to the Village Voice at that time. It was a free handout. There were kiosks at corners where you could just pick up your copy. I think it came out on Wednesday or Thursday, like the Village Voice. And I started hanging out with a woman there named Pat Wadsley, who had previously done publicity for David Bowie. She worked for Main Man.
Hmm.
She worked for After Dark magazine. She was one of the original editors of 16 magazine
About that.
with Danny Fields. And she and I started going to the Mud Club, which actually opened on Halloween 1978.
Oh, okay.
So it had been open for 2 months in 1978. And I would walk home. She lived downtown also at that point. I was living in Tribeca in the loft. And we would go to the Mud Club sometimes. And the B-52s were the opening night entertainment. They were a little known band at the time. They had the indie single Rock Lobster out on 99 Records, I believe. And that was about it.
Wow.
And but the play, and it was tucked away. No one knew that neighborhood at all anymore. You didn't, cab drivers didn't even know where White Street was.
I'm sure.
2 blocks below Canal, over towards Chinatown, sort of. Anyway, the place took off. Pat, in that she had a column at the Soho Weekly News, the Cabaret Beat column, she wound up talking to Steve Mass, the owner of the Mud Club. And, you know, Steve was the kind of person that whoever had his ear, that was who he listened to.
Got it.
Complaining, oh, it's a crazy scene outside. This one couldn't get in. That one couldn't get in. People didn't know who this person was. And he wanted someone. This is now the winter of '79. Maybe we're into February now. She said, hire Richard. And he said, Richard who? And she said, Richard Boch. And she gave him my phone number. I was home one night. He had apparently called her, and she said, listen, Steve Mass is going to call you right now. This is before the days of call waiting, before they were answering machines,
right.
Or before answering machines were popular. Literally, I hung up and the phone rang, and it was Steve Mass.
How about that?
And he said, Pat Wadsley tells me you know everyone. And, you know, for once I kept my mouth shut and I didn't say, oh, yeah, I know everybody.
Sure.
I just listened to what he had to say, because the fact was that I knew who everyone was, or that I believed it would be important to him in the Mud Club, but I didn't know everyone. I knew some of them. Well, anyway, he says, oh, come tomorrow night and talk to me. I'm like, well, I'm working, you know, I have a job. And you know what? He was gone. The phone call was over.
How about that?
So I actually got someone to fill in for me at the bar, at the ballroom. Went and talked to him. He gave me about 30 seconds of his time, maybe less. He was talking to someone. Finally I said, Steve, it's Richard Boch. Oh, Richard, hello, how are you? Be here tomorrow night at midnight. And then he returned to the conversation that he was engaged in. Wow. And I just stood there like, what? So something, though, told me, okay, this is going to be good.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I got a substitute for we're talking Friday and Saturday nights at the bar, at the ballroom in Soho. They were good money nights.
I imagine were.
Anyway, I showed up the next night. I don't think he told anyone. Apparently I was hired. I don't think he told any of the other people that he had hired me. So I was sort of being looked at like, what is this guy doing here? Anyway, to make a long story short, or to cut to the chase, it worked out. And I wound up staying for almost 2 years, 21 months.
Wow.
And, you know, no one had lasted that long in the course of the Mud Club. The Mud Club sort of limped into 1983. So it had a 4.5 year and change lifespan. And people say to me, why didn't the Mud Club last the way, like for years, the way Max's Kansas City did, or the way CBGB's did?
Right. I'm curious.
The thing about the Mud Club, in a way, it was like Studio 54, which people often mention it in the same breath, mostly because they existed at the same time, not because they were really similar, although there was a crossover. But the thing was, the Mud Club, like Studio, burned so hot for the first year or two that it was open that it would have been impossible to maintain that. And unlike what Max's had become or what CBGB's was, it was not a venue in the traditional sense. You know, if a band played, it was just something that happened during the course of the night at the Mud Club. So basically you went to the Mud Club to go to the Mud Club, and whatever happened. It might just be a DJ and dancing all night, or it might be the Talking Heads, or it might be the Go-Go's, or it might be Frank Zappa, or it might be, Lena Lovitch. I mean, those are just some of the bigger names.
Right, I'm sure.
So that's basically how I wound up there. He trusted me. I never handled his money, so I had every reason to be trusted. And
did you delegate who was allowed to go into the club, like Studio 50?
Besides recognizing people that I knew Steve would want in the club, I was able to say yes and no. And that was a big responsibility. I mean, I had just turned 25 years old.
I'm sure.
And, it became a very high profile job. People knew me. I mean, I would go to a store. I remember one time I went shopping for a Polaroid camera to buy myself one of those SX70s that were big at the time. And I went with Andy Ostro. Andy was the personal assistant to Patti Smith. She's listed as almost a band member on those first 4 albums. She still works for Patti today, 50 years later, 45.
How about that?
Andy and we were with me, and we walked into one of these camera joints in Midtown, like on 32nd or 33rd Street, where all the camera places used to be.
Right.
And the 2 girls behind the counter, were like, "Oh my God, it's Richard from the Mud Club." I mean, happened. That was a thing that happened. And I became Richard from the Mud Club in a way, people still know me as that today.
How about that? Well, we got a chance to play. First time was really unusual. I was in college. I graduated, and I was friends with Richard McGuire, who was I went to school with. That's how I met him from Liquid Liquid. We played there. It was a 12-piece. It's called the Idiot Orchestra, and we played at the Mud Club on a Tuesday night. And it was really a great experience because I never played in a club like that before. And it was such a mind-blowing experience to experience New York. And then the next couple of times was with the band. I think we had a 9/9 night with ESG.
Sure.
So it was always fascinating. And I think I remember John Belushi there one night.
Oh, John Belushi was a regular there.
I remember seeing him there.
You know what's interesting? And the connection there was Dan, his pal, his running buddy, his partner in crime, Dan Aykroyd, this is nothing. I'm not telling any secrets here. He was having an affair with a woman named Rosie Schuster, who was a writer on SNL.
Okay.
Separate from his wife.
Right.
And Rosie had rented a loft on the 4th floor of the Mud Club building.
Oh my gosh.
Dan was sort of a built-in.
That's funny.
In a way, Dan almost had a resentment that there would always be this crowd outside that he would have to either dig his way through to get into the building or dig his way out of to get out of the building. So John sort of came with Dan in a sense. The building was owned by a very successful artist named Ross Bleckner, who bought the building for practically nothing, like $100,000 in 1976.
Wow.
6-story building, and so Steve rented the first 2 floors from Ross Bleckner, and then the 3rd, 4th, and 5th were residential. Ross had the 6th and half of the 5th, and Dan was always downstairs at the bar drinking. John especially was always, you can really say, if those guys were in town, if they weren't working on a project,
right,
John was at the Mud Club.
How about that? And you see like other big stars, Lou Reed, David Bowie. All
the time. Lou Reed, people assume, I think, that Lou Reed came there. I can place him at the Mud Club like twice. He really wasn't. Everybody, he has a reputation as far as being a prickly character.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that reputation preceded him. And I think built into that, the reputation was real. And he wasn't sort of a socialite kind of club goer the way Bowie was, or even the way Iggy Pop was.
Oh, Iggy Pop, I'm sure.
the way there a lot of John Cale was there all the
Oh,
time.
I love John Cale. He was a
Yeah,
great
John
artist.
was there all the time. Nico was there all the time.
Oh, how about that?
Chris and Debbie were there a lot when they were in town, because again, we're 1979, 1980. We're parallel lines where, eat to the beat. So they were on tour constantly. Same with the Ramones, like Arturo Vega, the sort of fifth Ramone, if you will,
Right.
and, Johnny and Marky, they if they were in town, if the Ramones were in town, they would be there. Other people, Anita Pallenberg was there often. Mick Jagger was there occasionally. Plus the artists,
Oh, I'm sure.
a lot of the artists, and then all the no wave musicians like Lydia Lunch, like Judy Nylon, and then there was like Johnny
Hmm,
Thunders and Jerry Nolan and
amazing.
people like that. These people were regulars. They were there all the time.
So you must have a great memory to write the book. What was it, 2017 it came out?
Came out in 17. I actually started writing it in 2010. I
Okay.
spent 5 years writing it. I interviewed nearly 200 people for the book, many of them
Wow.
the names I just mentioned.
Okay.
And, I did take a lot of notes, or I kept a lot of mementos from specific nights, or
Okay.
just scribbles. There were also, I had the benefit that Steve was sort of a historian in the sense where he created these like Mud Club newsletters and things
Hmm.
like that. Plus, when I said I interviewed nearly 200 people, the actual count is 188. I only know that because I inventoried the hard copies of those interviews, the notes and the printouts from internet,
Hmm.
to coincide with all the taped interviews, and they were all put into my archive,
Okay.
uh, my Mud Club archive, which I was fortunate enough to sell in 2019, and so my point in mentioning that is, it's like when we talk and you say, "Oh, right. Oh, yeah." Or you'll say something and I'll go, "Oh, yeah." You'll talk about ESG and your
Hmm.
band, Liquid, and stuff like that. And I'll think, "Oh, yeah, those were great bands." You talk to that many people, it's undoubtedly it's going to come up that someone will say, "Oh my God, I never would have remembered that." Or you will say,
Hmm.
they will spur something in you to say those exact same words. "Oh my God, I never would have remembered that if you hadn't mentioned it." And that fed the book. That fed not only the information, but it fed the timeline, the overall narrative of the book. And, it made for a colorful history. I mean,
I'm
it is a
sure.
it's a personal memoir of my 2 years working there and my time before and my time after. But it's also not only a history in a sense. I'm not a historian, I'm a storyteller. So there is a history of the Mud Club, and there are the facts: who started it, when it closed, what happened during the course of those 2 years. But it's also the before and after of the neighborhood, of the scene, of who came and went,
Right.
who lived and died,
That's
and most
true.
importantly, who performed there, whether they were a musician or whether it was someone like photographer Nan Golden doing a slideshow on the wall of the second floor. You
Wow.
know, all
I,
of
for-
that.
I forgot about the second floor. Was that like a more artistic
Well,
floor?
it was a second level of restriction as far as after you
Oh,
got
okay.
past me, then you had to get past someone else.
Oh boy. Right.
Then I would either say, "Hey, let them up to the second floor," or they would know. I mean, I had two wonderful people. Most importantly, these two people were the gatekeepers to the second floor. One was a woman named Chichi Valenti, who she's the wife of Johnny Dynell, who was one of the DJs. And Chi Chi knows everyone. She's considered the empress of New York nightlife. She she's still very involved, and the other person was the actress Debbie Mazur, who was the best friend of who became post Mud Club, who became best friends with Madonna and still is one of Madonna's confidants to this day.
Oh, I see.
Debbie was 15 at the time.
Oh, how about that?
And that's another interesting fact that made the Mud Club so unique. The drinking age, you have to remember, at that time was 18.
Right.
So, and there were no wristbands to drink at the bar or show your proof when you. So there were a lot of 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds who were in the club at those days.
How about that?
Some of the bands were kids who were playing.
Right. I imagine. And then how hard was it to get all these interviews? I know it's hard for me to get these podcasts with people, but more or less all those people you got,
I stayed in touch. Something I'm proud of to this day, because there were moments where I was a real mess during that period, and I'm the first to admit that. But you know what? I'm sure we can say this on a YouTube interview.
Yeah.
I never fucked with anybody. I never made enemies. I never used my position to grind an axe. I'm not letting that one in because I let people in if they were supposed to be inside. If there was a reason that they should be inside, they came in, whether I liked them a lot, liked them a little, or didn't really care for them. If they treated me with respect at the door, I treated them with respect at the door. And so going back to how I got all those interviews, I remained friends with a lot of those people.
How about
over the decades. And when those people, it was almost odd that the Mud Club, the name the Mud Club, would be dropped in interviews with musicians, in interviews with artists, with fashion people, but no one ever did anything with it. No one ever wrote a book.
Right.
Steve Moss never wrote a book. God bless him. He's 83 years old now. Is he going to get a book? Is he going to get a book out? Who knows? Maybe. But I think people were, whoa, oh, Richard's going to write a book. Oh, people wanted to be interviewed. People, it's almost like a badge of courage that you were at the Mud Club, that you went to the Mud Club, that you were a Mud Club survivor.
Right.
And I think that was, that gave me a lot of access. Being the doorman there gave me a lot of access back then to, because I one hand washed the other. If the security or the door people from the Palladium, meaning when it was after it was the Academy of Music and there were still great bands there, when they came in, when they came to the door, I would let them in. Sure. So when I would go to the backstage door at the Palladium, whether it was for Public Image or whether it was for the Clash or whether it was for, Patti Smith or whoever, they would let me in. It was the same at the other clubs, if when Bond Casino was happening.
Right. I remember that with the Clash.
When those great Clash shows were happening.
Right.
Well, I was working still then, but I would go for at least a few songs almost every night I went, and breezed in and out. And that was one of the perks of working at the Mud Club. I saw some great bands. The Mud Club had some great bands I would never have seen anywhere. I got to see there, and as well as it gave me access to shows like at the Ritz. And I remember seeing like bands like Bow Wow Wow at the Ritz.
Yeah.
Probably never would have gone to see Bow Wow
Yeah.
Wow, but I had the opportunity and I went, and you know what? In those first year or two that they existed, they only really existed in that
Right.
formation for a year or two, but they were remarkable.
Yeah.
They were great.
Well, that
And
was such an amazing period of music for New York. It was such a capsule of, time capsule of
oh,
some
Dennis, it
really
was
great things.
terrific.
We were very lucky to be part of it. I was. And, we played all those clubs. The club opened within 2 months, maybe it would close. We played Danceteria, Hurrah, Mud Club. This place, the Underground, I think lasted like
Oh yeah, the
2 months.
Underground on Union Square there.
Yep.
Yep.
We played there, so we were very lucky, and we ended around 1983. We hung on for a little longer, but
Uh-huh.
we probably ended around the same time the Mud Club closed up, towards
Yes.
that same period.
I think at that point everybody sort of transitioned over to a club called Area, and
Okay.
at the same time, the Palladium had transitioned from being a rock palace to Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager had gotten out of jail, and they reopened it as
Okay.
as a club. Um, so that's where everybody went, and it was the '80s, and
Yes,
the Mud Club was a child of the late '70s. It existed on that cusp of two decades, '70s into '80s,
it did.
and the '80s became, well, as people know, the decade of big hair, big shoulders,
Right.
and big clubs.
Right.
Big, very commercial clubs.
And people went out very late. I
And
mean,
people went out very late and
our
stayed
shows,
out very late.
our shows sometimes were like 2 o'clock in the morning.
That's yeah.
And now, how late did the Mud Club? Was it open all night?
No, the Mud Club actually was legal as far as selling drinks at the bar.
Okay.
And the DJs on the first floor would phase out the music at 4 a.m.
Okay.
But the crowd who had access to the second floor,
Right.
so the second floor sometimes would go to 5 or 6 or even later. And it's questionable, was liquor served at 5 or 6 in the morning up there? Probably sometimes. Uh, did I just dip behind the bar and grab my own drinks at 5 or 6 in the morning? Probably
Right.
sometimes. Yep. But people hung out up there. It was like, I mean, this artist, Nathan Joseph, said to me when I interviewed him, he said that he said it was like a scene from Fellini's Satyricon, that second floor,
Oh my God.
at 4 or 5 in the morning.
I'm sure.
And this is a guy who's been around, this guy, Nathan Joseph. I mean, he worked for Mickey Ruskin for a while at the Lower Manhattan Ocean Club, where great band. It was Mickey's place between Max's and his last place called One University or Chinese Chance. And he knew everybody. He was Ellen Barkin's boyfriend for a while. But then again, who wasn't? It was a remarkable time. It really was. And that second floor was just, there was darkness, but there was light. It was
I
really
imagine.